Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the greatest survival flexes in history. How Native Americans built teepees that stayed warm and comfortable at temperatures where modern humans start panicking because the thermostat dropped 3 degrees. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. How Native Americans built and lived in teepees at minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The shape of shelter in a frozen world. If you imagine standing on the open Great Plains in the heart of winter, the wind would likely be the first thing you notice. It moves without interruption, sweeping across hundreds of miles of flat land, carrying snow that stings your face and drains warmth from your body in minutes. Temperatures drop far below freezing. At night, minus 30 degrees Celsius is not unusual. There are no trees close by, no stone buildings, no thick walls or chimneys. And yet, for centuries, families lived here, not briefly, but as part of a repeating seasonal rhythm that demanded patience, skill, and quiet resilience. This is where the teepee emerges, not as a symbol or decoration, but as a carefully engineered response to extreme conditions. To you, it might look simple, a cone of poles wrapped in animal hides or later canvas. But simplicity here is deceptive. Every angle, every seam, every opening reflects generations of trial, failure, and adaptation. Teepees were used by many Plains tribes, including the Lakota, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, Crow, and others. These societies were deeply mobile, following bison herds across vast territories. Mobility was not a choice, it was survival. A heavy, permanent structure would have failed them. What they needed was something portable, strong, warm, and quick to assemble. Something that could face brutal winters and still come down within an hour when it was time to move again. The basic structure began with long wooden poles, often lodgepole pine, harvested from distant forests and carried or traded over long distances. These poles were not interchangeable. Families knew which pole belonged where. Certain poles bore more weight. Others determined the doorway or smoke opening. Setting them incorrectly could cause collapse, especially under heavy snow or violent wind. Once erected, the poles formed a stable cone, a shape that matters more than you might expect. Cold air sinks. Warm air rises. The cone allows smoke from the central fire to rise and exit through adjustable flaps at the top, while fresh air enters near the ground. This airflow keeps smoke from filling the interior while preserving warmth. It is slow, controlled ventilation, something modern architecture often struggles to achieve. The covering was traditionally made from bison hides, sewn together with sinew. A large winter teepee could require up to 20 hides. Each hide had to be scraped, stretched, dried, and softened. This was laborious, unglamorous work, done slowly, often by hand, over many days. The result was a thick, insulating skin that blocked wind and retained heat far better than you might expect. Inside, life followed patterns that matched the structure itself. The fire burned low and steady, rarely roaring. Bedding was placed along the walls, raised slightly from the ground to avoid cold air pooling at floor level. Personal belongings were hung from the poles or stored behind the bedding. Nothing was random. Disorder wasted heat and space. In winter, an additional liner was often added, an inner wall of hide or cloth that created a pocket of still air between the outer cover and the living space. Snow packed around the base of the teepee was not removed. It acted as insulation. What might look to you like exposure was, in practice, a carefully controlled environment. Children learned early how to move inside without disturbing the balance. Elders knew how to read the wind and adjust the smoke flaps accordingly. Even small mistakes, placing the fire too high, leaving gaps at the base, could mean a cold, sleepless night. What is striking is not just that teepees worked, but that they worked repeatedly, reliably, over centuries. There were no written manuals. Knowledge passed quietly, through observation and correction. You learned by watching someone tie a rope the right way, by feeling the warmth shift when a flap was adjusted, by noticing which side of the teepee faced the morning sun. To live this way required attentiveness rather than speed. Survival did not come from rushing or overpowering the environment, but from cooperating with it, accepting wind, snow, and cold as constants rather than enemies. And yet, even with all this knowledge, winter on the plains remained unforgiving. Food had to be preserved. Firewood had to be gathered in advance. A single storm could trap a family inside for days. The teepee could protect you, but only if everything else went right. So as you sit quietly with this image, the low fire, the hides creaking slightly in the wind, the cold pressing from every direction, it raises a quiet question. How did daily life continue inside these shelters when winter stretched on for months, and survival depended on routines that left no room for error? Daily life inside the teepee when winter would not end. Once the teepee was standing firm against the wind and snow, the larger challenge began. Not building shelter, but living within it, day after day, while winter slowly exhausted both patience and supplies. At -30 degrees Celsius, survival depended less on dramatic action and more on quiet consistency. You did not conquer winter. You waited it out. Inside the teepee, space was limited, and that limitation shaped behavior. You could not pace. You could not separate yourself from others easily. Every movement affected someone else, stirring cold air, disturbing smoke flow, or brushing against bedding. Over time, people learned to move deliberately, efficiently, almost gently, as if the air itself required respect. The fire at the center was never allowed to burn wildly. Large flames wasted fuel and overheated the space near the ground while sending valuable warmth straight out through the smoke hole. Instead, fires were kept low and steady, fed with small pieces of wood or dried buffalo chips when trees were scarce. This fuel burned slowly and evenly, producing heat without excessive smoke. Children learned early not to add too much at once. Cooking followed similar restraint. Meals were simple and repetitive, especially in deep winter. Dried meat, rendered fat, and preserved berries formed the core of the diet. Pemmican, pounded dried meat mixed with fat, was compact, calorie-dense, and resistant to freezing. It did not look appealing, but it kept people alive. Eating was not about pleasure during winter, it was about endurance. Water posed another quiet problem. Snow had to be melted, which required fuel. Too much fire meant wasted wood. Too little meant dehydration. Snow was often melted slowly at the edge of the fire rather than directly over it. This avoided scorching containers and conserved heat. Even something as simple as drinking involved careful planning. Clothing rarely came off indoors. Layers were adjusted, not removed. Hides trapped warmth effectively, but sweat was dangerous. Damp clothing could freeze quickly once you stepped outside, or if the fire died down overnight. People learned to manage their own body heat carefully, loosening garments slightly during work and tightening them again when still. Sleep followed the rhythm of fire maintenance. Someone was usually responsible for waking during the night to tend the embers. This role rotated. The goal was not to stay fully warm, but warm enough to avoid frostbite or hypothermia. Bedding was layered with hides and grasses, positioned to minimize exposure to drafts near the door. Children were not sent outside to play aimlessly in winter. They stayed close, learning through observation. Stories were told quietly, often repetitive, reinforcing memory rather than entertainment. Elders spoke of past winters, migrations, and mistakes, not as lessons announced aloud, but as narratives that allowed younger listeners to absorb practical knowledge without instruction. The teepee itself required constant attention. Snow accumulation had to be monitored. Too much weight could strain poles or distort the cover. Smoke flaps needed adjustment as wind direction changed, sometimes multiple times a day. A sudden shift could fill the interior with smoke or pull heat out rapidly. Someone was always watching, listening, feeling the air. Despite the cold, people still went outside. Traps had to be checked. Firewood had to be gathered. Animals had to be tracked. Each departure from the teepee was deliberate. Faces were covered. Routes were memorized. Getting lost in a white landscape could be fatal even a short distance from camp. Illness, when it came, was especially dangerous. There were no isolated rooms, no way to separate the sick completely. Care was communal and quiet. Warmth, rest, and food were the primary treatments. Survival depended on the group's ability to support its weakest members without exhausting its resources. What stands out is how little was wasted: energy, movement, speech. Winter life inside a teepee was not about constant action, but about maintaining balance. Every choice, from how much wood to burn to when to speak, carried consequences. And yet, even with careful routines and shared knowledge, winters sometimes lasted longer than expected. Storms delayed hunts. Supplies ran low. The margin for error narrowed. So as winter dragged on and stored food thinned, another question quietly emerged inside the teepee walls. What happened when preparation was not enough and survival demanded decisions no one wanted to make? When the winter finally released its grip, by the time winter began to loosen its hold on the plains, survival was rarely dramatic. There were no clear victories, no single moment when danger ended. Instead, there was a gradual easing, longer daylight, softer winds, snow that melted instead of cutting. The teepee, which had endured months of strain, remained standing not because it was permanent, but because it had been constantly tended. If you were living inside one of these shelters, you would have felt the change first in the air. Smoke rose more easily. The fire needed less fuel to maintain warmth. The door flap stayed open slightly longer during the day, letting in pale sunlight that had been absent for months. These were small shifts, but they mattered. The final weeks of winter were often the most dangerous. Food stores were lowest, just as energy was most depleted. People were thinner. Tools showed wear. Hides were stiff from repeated freezing and thawing. A mistake made at this stage could undo months of careful restraint. And yet, routines held. What allowed these communities to survive was not exceptional strength or endurance, but predictability. The teepee had not been designed to impress. It was designed to function repeatedly under pressure. Its portability allowed people to follow food sources rather than wait for scarcity to end. Its structure minimized waste. Its interior forced cooperation. When spring finally arrived, the teepee could be taken down in less than an hour. Poles were unlashed. Hides were folded. The ground beneath, blackened by fire and pressed flat by months of living, was left behind. There were no foundations, no permanent scars. This was intentional. Permanence was a liability in a landscape that demanded movement. Looking back, it is tempting to describe this way of life as harsh or primitive, but doing so misses the point. The teepee was not a temporary solution waiting to be replaced by something better. It was a refined technology, shaped by centuries of observation, adjusted in response to failure, and sustained through collective memory rather than written instruction. Modern architecture often relies on insulation, central heating, and rigid materials to create comfort by separating people from their environment. The teepee did the opposite. It acknowledged wind, cold, and fire as forces to be managed rather than excluded. Comfort came from alignment, not control. This approach extended beyond shelter. It influenced how people planned journeys, stored food, raised children, and made decisions. Nothing existed in isolation. Survival was not individual. It was shared, quiet, and repetitive. When European settlers later encountered teepees, many misunderstood them. Some saw impermanence as weakness. Others dismissed them as temporary camps rather than engineered homes. Few recognized that these structures had solved problems that modern design would struggle with: ventilation without machinery, warmth without sealed walls, mobility without collapse. Today, when temperatures drop and systems fail, when power goes out or supply chains break, people often rediscover the same principles: layering, shared warmth, careful fuel use, and respect for limits. These are not innovations. They are rediscoveries. As you consider this story, not as an adventure, but as a long sequence of ordinary days survived through attention and restraint, it leaves a quiet reflection behind. How much of what we call progress has actually made us less prepared for simplicity, patience, and survival when systems disappear? What the teepee left behind. When the last traces of winter finally faded from the plains, there was rarely a clear line separating survival from normal life. The snow melted unevenly. Rivers broke open slowly. The ground softened in patches rather than all at once. And yet, movement returned. Camps shifted. The teepees that had sheltered families through the coldest months were folded, packed, and carried forward without ceremony. What is striking, if you pause to think about it, is how little evidence remained. A season of living, sleeping, cooking, telling stories, surviving sickness and hunger, left almost nothing behind. No stone walls, no foundations, only compressed earth and scattered ash, soon erased by wind and rain. This absence was not accidental. It reflected a worldview in which shelter served life, not legacy. The teepee was never meant to outlast its people. It was meant to adapt with them. For generations, this way of living continued with remarkable consistency. Knowledge did not accumulate as objects, but as habits. Children did not inherit houses. They inherited techniques. How to feel a draft before it became dangerous. How to judge firewood by weight alone. How to listen to wind and know whether to adjust the smoke flaps now or wait. Even leadership was shaped by this environment. Authority did not come from controlling resources locked behind walls, but from understanding movement, timing, and restraint. A leader who wasted supplies or ignored seasonal warning signs endangered everyone. Survival rewarded patience more than ambition. When colonial expansion disrupted this rhythm, it did so unevenly. Firearms changed hunting. Trade goods replaced hides with canvas. Forced settlement disrupted migration patterns that teepees depended on. The structure itself survived longer than the system around it. A teepee without freedom of movement lost much of its purpose. By the late 19th century, many indigenous families were compelled to live in fixed housing unsuited to the plains climate. These buildings, meant to represent progress, often performed worse in extreme weather than teepees ever had. Poor insulation, inadequate heating, and inflexible layouts introduced new forms of discomfort and vulnerability. What was lost was not merely a structure, but a way of thinking about shelter. The teepee assumed change. It assumed limits. It assumed cooperation. Modern housing often assumes stability, abundance, and constant infrastructure. When those assumptions fail, discomfort quickly becomes crisis. In quiet ways, the lessons of teepee living still echo. Emergency shelters borrow its shape. Outdoor survival training repeats its principles. Even minimalist architecture rediscovers ideas long practiced on the plains. Airflow over bulk, insulation through layering, warmth through shared space. And yet, much of this knowledge remains categorized as primitive, a word that hides more than it explains. The teepee was not primitive. It was precise. It solved a specific set of problems with limited materials, repeated success, and minimal waste. If you imagine yourself returning to that winter landscape one last time, the low fire glowing, the hides pulled tight against the wind, you may realize something quietly unsettling. Survival here did not depend on technology advancing, but on people paying attention, noticing small changes, respecting constraints, accepting discomfort without panic. As the teepee disappears into history books and museum displays, its deeper lesson remains unresolved. In a world increasingly built on permanence and excess, what knowledge have we quietly set aside that once made survival ordinary, sustainable, and shared? Winter as a long condition, not a season. If you were a peasant living in medieval Europe, winter was not a dramatic event that arrived suddenly and left just as quickly. It was a condition, slow, repetitive, and expected. You did not measure it in storms or dates, but in how long the cold lingered in your bones, how thin your food stores became, and how many weeks passed before the soil could be touched again. Your house, if it can be called that, would likely have been a single-room structure made of timber, wattle and daub, or rough stone, depending on region and wealth. The roof was thatched. The floor was earth. There were no sealed windows, only shutters or holes covered with cloth or animal skin. Heat escaped constantly, and cold entered without asking permission. The hearth sat at the center, much like the fire in a teepee, but it was far less efficient. Smoke often filled the room before finding its way out through a hole in the roof or a poorly drawn chimney. Eyes watered, lungs burned, but the fire stayed low. Fuel was precious, and a roaring fire meant an empty woodpile by midwinter. You would not have expected warmth as we understand it. The goal was not comfort. The goal was to avoid freezing. Winter preparation began months earlier. By late summer and autumn, everything you did pointed toward survival rather than abundance. Grain was harvested and stored carefully, protected from damp and rodents. Vegetables were pickled or buried in pits. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked. Nothing fresh was expected once winter settled in. Hunger was not a surprise, it was planned for. When winter arrived, daily life contracted. You rose later because daylight was scarce. You slept longer because there was little reason to move in the cold darkness. Work continued, but slowly. Tools were repaired. Clothing was mended. Straw bedding was refreshed to create insulation between your body and the frozen ground. Clothing was layered, heavy, and rarely washed during winter. Linen undergarments trapped body heat but absorbed sweat, while outer layers retained warmth even when damp. Shoes were thin by modern standards, often little more than leather wrapped around the foot. Cold toes were normal. Numb fingers were expected. Inside the house, people stayed close. Livestock, chickens, goats, sometimes even a cow, were often brought indoors or into adjoining spaces. Their body heat mattered. Their presence was not sentimental, it was practical. The smell was tolerated because the alternative was colder nights. Meals were monotonous. Bread, often dark and coarse, formed the base of most diets. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever scraps were available, was eaten daily. Meat was rare. Fat was prized. Eating enough to stay alive mattered more than taste. Silence filled much of the day. There were no clocks to divide time precisely. You measured hours by light and tasks. Storytelling existed, but it was not constant. Speech used energy. Even conversation could feel like effort when calories were limited. Illness spread easily in these conditions. Cold weakened bodies. Smoke damaged lungs. Malnutrition lowered resistance. When someone fell ill, there was little separation. Care happened in the same room, near the same fire. Death was not hidden. It was witnessed quietly, often without ceremony, because survival left little room for prolonged mourning. What kept people alive was not strength, but routine. You did the same things every day because routine conserved energy and reduced mistakes. You did not experiment in winter. You relied on what had worked before. And yet, even with careful preparation, winter sometimes lasted longer than expected. Snow delayed planting. Frost returned after brief thaws. Stores dwindled earlier than planned. As you sit with this image, a low fire struggling against cold walls, bodies pressed close, the smell of smoke and damp wool, it raises an uncomfortable question. What happened when winter stretched beyond what preparation could support, and hunger became unavoidable rather than managed? Hunger, darkness, and the slow math of survival. As winter deepened, Survival for medieval peasants became less about shelter and more about numbers. How many mouths? How much grain? How many days until spring? This arithmetic was never written down, but everyone understood it. You felt it each time a loaf grew smaller, each time the pot was filled with more water and fewer vegetables. Hunger in winter was rarely sudden. It crept in quietly. Portions shrank. Meals stretched thinner. Bread that had once been eaten fresh was now stale or mold-specked, scraped clean and baked again if possible. Flour was mixed with whatever could extend it: ground peas, beans, even bark or dried weeds in the worst years. Taste mattered less than bulk. You would still eat every day, but eating no longer satisfied. It simply delayed weakness. The cold made hunger sharper. Your body burned more energy just to stay warm. But replacing that energy was difficult. Fat, the most valuable winter food, was limited. Animal fat came from slaughtered pigs or cattle in autumn, preserved carefully and rationed through the winter months. Once it was gone, meals became harder to digest and less sustaining. Children suffered first. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster and needed more frequent nourishment. Elderly people followed. Their strength faded quietly. In winter, illness and hunger blended together so closely that it was difficult to tell which came first. Work did not stop, but it changed. Fields lay frozen, but animals still needed care. Water had to be fetched through ice. Firewood had to be gathered even as forests thinned near villages. Each trip outside carried risk: slips, frostbite, exhaustion. Returning empty-handed was not an option. Inside the house, light was scarce. Candles were expensive. Tallow lamps smoked and smelled. Often, people simply endured darkness. Long hours passed in near silence, broken only by coughing, the crackle of the hearth, or the wind pressing against the walls. Sleep filled the gaps, not always because people were tired, but because being awake required energy. Faith played a role here, though often quietly. Winter hardship was seen as part of a larger order: punishment, testing, or simply the way the world worked. Prayer did not produce food, but it gave structure to waiting. Saints' days and church calendars helped mark time when days blurred together. Communal survival mattered. Villages shared what little flexibility they had. A family with a slightly larger store might help a neighbor, knowing that roles could reverse next winter. This was not generosity in the modern sense, but risk management. Letting someone starve weakened the entire community. Still, some winters broke people. Records speak of famine years when bread prices soared, livestock died, and bodies weakened beyond recovery. These were not dramatic collapses, but long declines. People did not panic. They endured until endurance failed. When spring finally approached, it did not immediately bring relief. The hunger gap, the weeks between winter stores running out and new crops becoming available, was often the most dangerous period of all. People were weakest just as work returned to the fields. So as the days slowly lengthened and the ground softened enough to touch again, another quiet question lingered in every household. After surviving the winter, did life truly improve, or was survival itself the only reward waiting on the other side? After the thaw, what survival actually meant. When winter finally loosened its grip on the medieval countryside, relief did not arrive all at once. There was no sudden warmth, no guaranteed abundance. Instead, survival entered a quieter, more uncertain phase, one shaped by exhaustion, weakened bodies, and the long memory of scarcity. If you were a peasant stepping into early spring, you would feel thinner than you had been months before. Your clothes hung looser. Your strength returned slowly, unevenly. Winter had not ended with rest. It had ended with depletion. And yet, work resumed immediately. The land did not wait for recovery. Fields needed turning as soon as the frost allowed. Tools dulled during winter repairs now met stubborn soil. Every movement required effort. Hunger had not disappeared, often it worsened. The last of the stored grain was usually gone by now, while new crops were still weeks or months away. This period, later known as the Hunger Gap, tested communities as harshly as winter itself. You might eat once a day, sometimes less. Pottage grew thinner still. Bread, when available, was mixed with whatever could stretch it. Foraging returned cautiously: nettles, early greens, roots, anything edible that emerged from the soil. These foods were not chosen for flavor, but because they existed. Illness followed closely behind hunger. Bodies weakened by months of cold and undernourishment struggled to resist infection. Coughs lingered. Wounds healed slowly. Many who survived winter did not survive spring. Death records, where they exist, often rise during these months, not in the coldest weeks, but in the aftermath. Despite this, life did not pause. Seeds had to be planted on time. Missing a planting window could mean starvation the following winter. So people worked, even when tired, even when sick. Children joined as soon as they could walk steadily. Elders contributed where possible, mending tools, watching animals, passing on knowledge quietly. What kept villages functioning was not optimism, but habit. People had lived through winters before. They expected loss. They measured success not by comfort, but by continuity. Another season begun, another year not yet ended. Homes changed little. The same smoke-darkened walls, the same packed earth floors. Warmth increased slightly, but fires were still conservative. Wood supplies needed replenishing for the next winter, and careless burning now meant suffering later. Planning never stopped. Religion framed much of this endurance. Survival was often interpreted as moral balance, reward, punishment, or trial. Church calendars provided structure when physical certainty was absent. Feast days, even modest ones, punctuated scarcity and reminded people that time was moving forward. Community bonds tightened and strained at the same time. Shared suffering created obligation, but also resentment. Debts accumulated, not always in coin, but in memory. Who shared food? Who did not? Who survived? Who did not? These things were remembered quietly. What is striking, when you step back, is how little changed from year to year. Winter hardship was not an exception. It was an expected phase of life. Survival was not heroic. It was repetitive. Most people who lived through medieval winters left no record of bravery or innovation. They survived by doing what had been done before, even when it was barely enough. And yet, this persistence shaped history more than battles or kings. Agricultural rhythms, population growth, settlement patterns, all were governed by how well ordinary people endured cold, hunger, and fatigue. Empires rose and fell, but villages lived or disappeared based on winter outcomes. Modern life often treats survival as a crisis state, something temporary and extraordinary. For medieval peasants, it was the baseline. Comfort was rare. Stability was fragile. But continuity, life continuing despite discomfort, was achievable. As you sit with this final image of early spring, muddy fields, tired bodies, thin meals, it leaves a quiet, unsettling reflection behind. If survival itself was the primary achievement for most of history, how has modern comfort changed our understanding of what it means to endure? The winters that shaped a lifetime. Long after a single winter ended, its effects remained written quietly into peasant lives. Survival did not reset the body or the household. It accumulated consequences. Each cold season left marks that did not fade with spring. Aching joints, weakened lungs, fewer teeth, thinner soil, smaller reserves of strength. If you lived through many winters, you did not remember them as separate events. They blended together. You spoke of hard years and good years, but even good years contained hunger, and hard years were never entirely unexpected. This long familiarity with scarcity shaped how people thought, planned, and behaved. Marriage decisions were influenced by winter survival. Families delayed weddings until food was sufficient. Children were spaced not by choice, but by endurance. A woman weakened by repeated winters and poor nutrition faced higher risks in childbirth. Infant mortality spiked after harsh seasons, not because parents cared less, but because bodies had nothing left to give. Land use reflected this reality. Fields were not worked for maximum yield, but for reliability. Crop diversity mattered more than profit. A harvest that produced less but failed less often was preferred to one that promised abundance but risked total loss. This conservative approach, repeated over generations, slowed innovation but stabilized survival. Houses themselves became records of winter adaptation. Smoke-blackened rafters told stories of countless low fires. Thicker thatch meant fewer drafts. Narrow doors reduced heat loss. These changes happened slowly, almost invisibly, as small adjustments passed from one generation to the next without explanation. Peasants did not romanticize this life. There was no sense that hardship was noble. It was simply unavoidable. Complaints existed, but expectations were limited. You did not hope for warmth. You hoped for tolerable cold. You did not hope for full stomachs. You hoped for enough. Over time, this shaped emotional restraint. Excessive joy invited disappointment. Excessive grief threatened endurance. Emotional balance became another survival tool. This is why medieval records often feel detached or sparse. Life left little space for reflection beyond necessity. When climate shifted, even slightly, the effects were immediate. Colder decades shortened growing seasons. Wetter winters ruined stored grain. These changes did not cause sudden collapse, but long attrition. Villages shrank. Marginal lands were abandoned. People migrated quietly, not as refugees, but as families seeking slightly better odds elsewhere. History often remembers these centuries as static, but they were not. They were shaped by millions of small decisions made under winter pressure. When to slaughter an animal, when to eat seed grain, when to risk travel. Each decision carried consequences that echoed years later. Eventually, technologies changed. Chimneys improved. Crop rotation advanced. New fuels became available. Winters did not disappear, but their grip loosened. Heat became more reliable. Food storage improved. Survival shifted slowly from constant calculation to occasional concern. Yet even as conditions improved, habits lingered. People continued to save, to layer clothing indoors, to distrust abundance. These behaviors were not superstition. They were memory, passed down long after the original threat faded. In this way, medieval winter survival did more than shape a season. It shaped a mindset, one built on caution, patience, and acceptance of limits. Modern comfort often views these traits as unnecessary or pessimistic. But for centuries, they were the reason communities endured at all. As you let this story settle, not as a tale of misery but of persistence, it leaves behind a final, quiet question, one that reaches beyond medieval fields and into the present day. When warmth, food, and security become assumed rather than earned, what forms of resilience quietly fade with them? Waiting at the end of the world. If you imagine a Roman soldier, you might picture movement, marching columns, clashing shields, shouted commands echoing across open ground. But if you had actually lived as a soldier on the far edge of the Roman Empire, movement would have been the exception. Waiting would have been your profession. You might be stationed along the northern frontier, near the Rhine or the Danube, or perhaps on Hadrian's Wall in Britannia. From Rome, this was the edge of the known world. From your perspective, it was simply where you lived. Cold winds cut across open land. Rain fell often. The horizon rarely changed. Your fort was built of stone or timber, carefully measured and almost identical to others across the empire. Standardization mattered. It allowed men from distant provinces to function together with minimal confusion. Gates aligned with roads. Barracks mirrored one another. Order was imposed on unfamiliar landscapes. Daily life followed a schedule that rarely varied. You rose at first light, regardless of weather. Armor was checked, weapons inspected, not because battle was expected, but because discipline filled time. Drills were repetitive. Formations practiced long after perfection had been achieved. Muscles remembered movements even when minds drifted elsewhere. Much of your day was spent maintaining the fort itself. Walls needed repair. Ditches filled with water and debris. Roads required leveling. These tasks were not glamorous, but they mattered. A neglected fort invited decay long before it invited enemies. Food was simple and consistent. Grain formed the base of your diet, ground, boiled, baked into coarse bread. Meat appeared occasionally, more often as preserved rations than fresh cuts. You ate to sustain effort, not to enjoy meals. Hunger was rare compared to peasant life, but satisfaction was equally rare. Water came from nearby rivers or wells, carried daily. Firewood had to be gathered. In colder provinces, heating mattered more than in Rome. Barracks were drafty. Fires burned low. Warmth was limited and shared. Between duties, there was waiting. You waited for orders that did not come. You watched roads that stayed empty. You listened for signals that rarely sounded. Letters from home arrived slowly, if at all. Many soldiers would never return to their place of birth. Service lasted decades. Time passed not through events, but through repetition. Days blended together. Seasons were marked by changes in clothing rather than action. The empire felt distant, abstract, something you served but rarely saw. And yet, presence alone mattered. The fort existed to be seen. Patrols demonstrated control even when no resistance appeared. Stability was maintained not through constant violence, but through constant readiness. As you stood watch, looking out at land that felt endless and indifferent, a quiet question likely surfaced again and again. What was the purpose of this waiting? And how did soldiers endure lives defined more by routine than by glory? Routine as discipline, discipline as survival. Once the novelty of military life faded, and it faded quickly, what remained for a Roman soldier on the empire's edge was routine. Not the dramatic kind remembered in histories, but the slow, grinding repetition that shaped both body and mind. Discipline was not enforced solely to prepare you for battle. It was enforced to prevent stagnation, decay, and quiet collapse. Your day was divided carefully, even if clocks were absent. Trumpet calls marked transitions, morning assembly, work assignments, drills, evening duties. These sounds imposed order on time, making days predictable in places where the landscape offered little structure of its own. Predictability reduced anxiety. You knew what was expected of you, even when the reason was unclear. Training never truly stopped. Weapons practice continued long after competence was achieved. Shields were lifted and lowered thousands of times. Wooden swords heavier than real ones were swung repeatedly to build strength. These exercises were exhausting, but they filled hours that might otherwise invite doubt. An idle soldier was a dangerous soldier, not because he might rebel, but because boredom eroded obedience. Uniformity extended beyond training. Equipment was standardized. Clothing followed regulation patterns, adapted slightly for climate. Repairs were constant. Leather cracked in cold provinces. Metal rusted in damp air. Much of your time was spent preserving what you already had. Maintenance, not conquest, defined your labor. Social life existed, but it was bounded by hierarchy. You lived among men from different regions: Gauls, Iberians, Syrians, North Africans, each bringing habits, accents, and beliefs. Latin served as a shared language of command, but everyday speech blended into something less formal. This mixture created familiarity without intimacy. You relied on each other, but rarely chose each other. Pay arrived irregularly. Deductions were made for food, clothing, and equipment. What remained was modest. Some soldiers saved, hoping for land or security after discharge. Others spent quickly, knowing that tomorrow was uncertain. Taverns near forts thrived on this rhythm, offering warmth, distraction, and temporary escape. Relationships formed cautiously. Officially, soldiers were discouraged or forbidden from marriage during active service, though many formed unofficial families with local women. These relationships existed in a legal gray area, tolerated but not protected. Children born from them were not always recognized. Affection came with risk. Religion filled quiet gaps. Shrines inside forts honored Roman gods alongside local deities. Soldiers prayed not for glory, but for survival, health, and an end to service. Rituals marked time when nothing else did. They reminded you that endurance itself had meaning. Illness and injury were constant concerns. Not dramatic wounds, but infections, joint pain, respiratory problems from damp quarters. Medical care existed, but it was basic. Recovery depended on rest, which was limited. Many soldiers completed service with bodies permanently altered by years of strain. What held everything together was the promise, often distant, sometimes unrealized, of discharge. After roughly 25 years, you might receive citizenship, land, or a pension. This future was spoken of often. It justified the present. It turned waiting into investment. Yet not everyone reached that point. Disease, accidents, and occasional violence claimed men quietly. Their absence was absorbed into the routine. Another recruit took their place. The fort continued to function. As days turned into years, and years into decades, the question shifted. It was no longer about why you waited, but whether waiting had changed you beyond recognition. When discipline replaces choice and routine replaces purpose, what part of a person quietly disappears first? The long years and the quiet ending of service. By the time you reached the later years of your service, the fort no longer felt temporary. What once seemed like an assignment now felt permanent. You knew the sound of the wind against the walls in every season. You could tell the time of day by the light in the barracks without looking outside. The frontier, once foreign, had become familiar in a way that Rome never would again. Your body carried the record of years spent waiting. Knees stiffened in the cold. Shoulders ached from repeated drills. Old injuries never fully healed. You adjusted your movements without thinking, favoring one side, lifting more slowly. No one commented. Everyone did the same. Rank brought small changes. Veterans were given slightly better duties, fewer night watches, more responsibility over younger men. Authority was quiet, practical. You corrected mistakes because mistakes made work harder for everyone. Discipline was no longer imposed. It was internalized. You had watched recruits arrive full of energy and uncertainty, and you had watched them become predictable, efficient, and tired. You saw yourself in them and did not speak of it. Time passed through replacement rather than reflection. Campaigns occasionally interrupted routine. Marches, skirmishes, brief violence. These moments were remembered not for excitement, but for how quickly they disrupted order. Afterward, there was relief in returning to walls, schedules, and familiar tasks. Action, paradoxically, felt less safe than waiting. Letters from home, if they arrived at all, carried news that made distance heavier. Parents aged or died. Siblings married. Towns changed. You belonged fully to neither place, the frontier nor your origin. Discharge promised freedom, but also uncertainty. When service finally ended, it was rarely dramatic. You were released with papers, perhaps a plot of land near the fort, maybe citizenship if you did not already have it. Some stayed nearby, unable or unwilling to leave the life they understood. Others left immediately, chasing an idea of home that no longer existed. What remained was habit. You woke early even without a trumpet. You measured days by routine rather than desire. Silence felt familiar. Crowds felt overwhelming. The skills that had kept you alive, obedience, restraint, endurance, were no longer clearly useful. History remembers the Roman army as an engine of conquest, but on the edges of empire, it was also a machine of endurance. Its power came not from constant victory, but from men willing to live ordinary lives under extraordinary restraint. As you sit with this final image, a veteran standing outside the fort for the last time, unsure whether to stay or go, it leaves a quiet question behind. one that echoes beyond Rome itself. When a life is shaped almost entirely by waiting and routine, how does one learn to choose again once the structure disappears? What remained after the watch ended? Long after individual soldiers left the frontier forts, the habits they carried did not disappear. The Roman Empire's strength was never only in its battles, but in the way ordinary men adapted to long stretches of uneventful time and still maintained order. This quiet endurance left marks far beyond the walls they guarded. If you stayed near your old fort after discharge, as many did, you likely became part of a settlement that grew slowly around the military presence. Traders, craftsmen, families, and former soldiers created communities whose rhythms mirrored the army's structure. Streets followed the fort's grid. Markets operated on predictable schedules. Order remained, even when the legion moved on. Your habits shaped civilian life. You rose early. You valued routine. You repaired things rather than replacing them. Waste felt dangerous. Excess felt unfamiliar. You spoke little about your service, not because it was secret, but because most of it felt unremarkable even to you. For those who returned to distant homelands, reintegration was often uneasy. Civilian life lacked the clear structure of military routine. Decisions multiplied. Authority was diffuse. Days no longer followed signals. Some veterans thrived, using discipline to build farms or businesses. Others struggled, feeling unmoored without constant direction. The frontier itself changed under this quiet presence. Roads remained long after legions departed. Forts became towns. Boundaries hardened into borders. What had once been a temporary military solution gradually became a permanent political reality. The act of waiting, repeated generation after generation, turned edges into centers. Psychologically, this way of life normalized restraint. Roman soldiers learned to suppress impulse, endure boredom, and follow systems larger than themselves. These traits helped maintain imperial stability, but they also narrowed individual expression. Identity became tied to role rather than preference. When the empire later weakened, it was not sudden collapse that undid it, but erosion of this discipline. Pay failed. Supply lines broke. Routine fractured. Soldiers deserted not because they lacked courage, but because the structure that made waiting tolerable disappeared. From a distance, history often credits emperors, reforms, or invasions. But at ground level, Rome lasted as long as men were willing to stand watch over landscapes that rarely rewarded their presence. The empire was built not only through conquest, but through the patience of those who guarded places where nothing happened. Modern life rarely asks for this kind of endurance. Waiting is treated as inefficiency. Routine is seen as limitation. Yet infrastructure, institutions, and stability still depend on people willing to perform uncelebrated tasks consistently. As you let this story settle, the quiet fort, the empty road, the soldier watching without expectation, it leaves a final reflection behind, one that reaches beyond Rome and into the present. In a world that prizes speed and constant change, who is still willing to stand watch over the ordinary? And what happens when no one is?